Thank you, Professor Agnaldo. I would like to thank to Rodrigo, Sally, and Luis Felipe in the presence of Professor Nelson Gomes here. And so, let's go to the talk. God and goodness. This is only a quotation from Derek Parfit. Non-religious ethics is at a very early stage. We cannot yet predict whether in mathematics we will all reach agreement, since we cannot know how ethics will develop. It's not irrational to have high hopes. In this presentation, I shall outline an application of meta-ethics to the debate about the relationship between morality and the existence of God. Specifically to the thesis that morality depends necessarily on divine approval, divine command, without which it could not have sound foundations. Call this the dependence thesis. Some theists argue that if God does not exist, we have not a sound foundation for morality. Craig suggested that if theism is true, we have a sound foundation for morality. If it is false, we have not. For him, objective moral values, objective moral duties, and objective moral accountability depend on divine approval. We have this argument. I call the argument from objective morality. If God does not exist, then objective morality is illusory. Objective morality is not illusory. Therefore, God exists. But we have some skeptics and moral skeptics that use the dependence thesis in an argument against the existence of objective morality. I call this the argument from atheism. Morality is objective only if God exists. God does not exist. Therefore, morality is not objective. In both cases, the same idea. A sound morality needs God's approval and God's command. I will argue that it does not need it. And this is because moral objectivity does not require singular approval and command. This is part of a debate not only in philosophy of religion, but in meta-ethics and in general ethics. But part of my discussion depends on philosophers of religion like Swinburne, Craig, Van Inwagen, and some like philosophers. I forgot to say that I thank you very much for the presence of the Professor Swinburne here, of course, not only Nelson and Agnaldo, especially because my reflection in philosophy of religion is not only a professional interest, but to a personal interest, and because I have many good connections with Oxford, where Professor lives. In this presentation, I'll assume that nature and logic of evaluative words like good, bad, right, wrong ought to establish what we are doing when we meet moral judgments, and they thereby elucidate how we should understand what objective moral judgments and moral truths mean. This is a meta-ethics explanation. I also assume that philosophical theses on the relationship between morality and God's commands can be fruitfully understood upon the application of this elucidation. The first part, goodness, the importance of being logical. The meta-ethics series are broadly divided into moral realism, divided into naturalism and intuitionism, and moral non-realism divided into nihilism, subjectivism, and non-cognitivism. Broadly speaking, moral realism states that moral judgments are beliefs, that such beliefs are apt to true as any other descriptive judgment, and that at least some of them are true. The realist philosopher defends the judgment genocide is wrong as being able to be true regardless our particular and subjective opinion on whether it is wrong or not. Just as the judgment that the earth revolves around the sun is true or is fit to be true regardless of what we subjectively think about it. Since descriptive judgments have true conditions, realists will be naturalists or intuitionists, depending on how they understand and explain the true conditions of evaluative judgments. If the true conditions of these judgments are natural properties, facts, they are naturalists. If they are non-natural properties, I mean directly evaluative moral facts, they will be intuitionists. The conception of truth that can be adopted here is the trivial conception of truth as correspondence, and in this case, that in which the judgments adequately describe or report the moral reality, and one in which such adjustment would make them true. The conception of knowledge that may be adopted here is the trivial conception of knowledge as justified true belief. In the other side of the meta-ethics series, we have these three ones. Nihilists and subjectivists are non-realists because they deny that moral judgments can be objectively true. Nihilists agree with the realists that moral judgments are prima facie beliefs apt to true, but these judgments will never be true because the moral reality to which they correspond simply does not exist. Subjectivists argue that such judgments cannot be true objectively, as they make the content of moral beliefs necessarily relative to the opinions and decisions of the individuals who possess them. In subjectivism, when a subject S or group of subjects S states that genocide is wrong, he is reporting that he disapproves of genocide. And if he really does, the judgment is true for this subject or for this group of subjects. Its content will never be objectively true regardless of the opinion or decision of the individual or the group. Here in this presentation, I will assume nihilism as subsumity in subjectivism, since both share the denial that there are objective moral truths. Non-cognitivists, or as I prefer, non-descriptivists, deny that moral judgments are beliefs, and in this sense they are non-realists. For them, moral judgments do not work primarily to describe a moral reality, whether it's natural or non-natural, but to objectively evaluate the natural reality, the natural facts. For them, the main function of valuable words in moral sentence is to express attitudes, and thus such words carry an extra non-descriptive element, approval or prescribing, in its meaning, and they transfer it to value judgments. Non-cognitivists will be emotivists or rationalists, depending on whether they think this extra non-descriptive meaning has or has not a logic that governs moral reasoning. Here I consider only rationalist non-cognitivism, recently called rationalist expressivism. Rationalists interpret the judgments that Hitler was a bad person as an objective evaluation prescription, one that all of us who mobilizes moral judgments, and in particular all rational moral thinkers using only logic and facts about Hitler, would adopt it. Well, that was the picture about 4 kinds of big series in metaethics. Now I will treat about evaluative language and its functions. Take these 3 important aspects of moral judgments and commonly used and with which each metaethical theory has to deal. Firstly, moral judgments necessarily refer to facts, actions, agents, institutions, etc., and have so a predictive function, a cognitive function. Secondly, moral judgments serve to approve or disapprove such actions, agents, etc., and so they have a practical function. And thirdly, there is a necessary covariance between moral properties or values of action, agents, etc., and its non-moral properties, the facts. A covariance called the supervenience of moral properties on non-moral properties. According to supervenience thesis, there must necessarily be some non-moral difference between 2 situations if we express different moral judgments about them. And such covariance is related to both functions, the predicative and the practical. A meta-ethical theory falls depending on its accommodation and the coherent explanation of, first, the 2 functions, the 2 roles, 2, the supervenience, and 3, the relationship between them, supervenience, and the 2 roles. The accommodation and the explanation of the supervenience, for example, may it possible or not that impossible moral worlds may exist. Supervenience is a problem for all mentioned theories, metaethic theories, but it seems to affect more intensively intuitionism and subjectivism. Why? Such theories are good candidates for theories that do not accommodate or explain supervenience, as they allow there to be impossible moral worlds. Impossible moral worlds are moral worlds different with the same natural properties in each of them. If supervenience is true, there is no possible that a possible world would be identical in all facts and be not identical and moral facts or moral properties. But intuitionism and subjectivism make this the case. It's possible, moral impossible worlds. And these theories are highly problematic, may be simply false. Intuitionists, for example, claim that evaluative terms refer to events, but these events are not defined in natural terms. Rather, values are sui generis properties of a moral reality that is different of the natural reality. And the objectivity of evaluative judgments is not determined by facts in the sense of natural facts. Objectivity is determined by moral facts existing in the moral reality of the world. Such special events define the values and determine the moral truth. A possible world that were naturally identical to this actual world, but that was evaluatively different from it, could exist logically in intuitionism. It would have the same natural facts, but it would not have the same moral facts, which are sui generis and independent from the natural ones. In each one of these naturally identical possible worlds, there could be different moral truths. The supervenience was not accommodated in this picture. Similarly, in subjectivism, a possible world with the same natural properties as other worlds could have different moral values and moral truths, depending solely on the approval or disapproval by the subjects present in these worlds. Even within a unique world, there could be different values and moral truths with this same natural properties. One action, for example, in the future, with the same natural properties as now, or in the past, could have its moral content modified from right to wrong, or from wrong to right, arbitrarily. Naturally identical worlds, such as, for example, having genocidal national leaders like Hitler, maybe in these natural identical worlds. If subjectivism is true, these naturally identical worlds morally approved, disapproved in different ways via particular arbitrary decisions which do not depend on descriptive properties of Hitler and other consequences of his actions, character, institutions, policies, etc. A simple subjectivist approval cannot be disciplined by the logic of supervenience. Therefore, supervenience is not accommodated and explained by intuitionists and by subjectivists, and these conceptions on what it means to make moral judgments about what value terms refer to, and about how such judgments may or may not be true, are not good ideas and should not be used in discussions involving the nature of morality. The condemnation of intuitionism and subjectivism in terms of supervenience and possible worlds is not moral argumentation, but logical argumentation. These were conceptual, not moral movements. For example, they are linked not to the morality of changing from bad guy to good guy when we speak about Hitler. They are linked to the logicality of changing evaluation in one situation, for example, in the future, without the necessity of changing the evaluation in another one, for example, in the past, with the same properties. The nature of moral judgments in naturalistic or in non-cognitivist terms explains supervenience. That is because for naturalists and for rational non-cognitivists, natural facts determine what is wrong or right. For naturalists, good is defined in terms of some natural property, like, for example, preference maximization. And if a situation 2 is identical with situation 1 in preference maximization features, they could be morally different. Therefore, there will never be the case that a possible world with the same natural properties than the actual world be morally different from it. So supervenience is explained. For rational non-cognitivists, good is defined in terms of universal approval language, the logic of approval contained in the ordinary language, and this explains supervenience easily. We cannot use the term good for situation 1 and bad for situation 2 if they have the same features, because it would be like to call red a singular car and after call yellow another singular car that have both the same color. My children would not learn to use red or good, for example, and they could not learn what they ought to do if the situation 2 is bad or the action 2 is wrong and situation 1 is good and the action 1 is right, being the same in natural descriptive properties. Then from the supervenience challenge, only naturalism and rational non-cognitivism have survived. These two theories exclude explicitly two things. First, they excluded that decisions, subjective decisions, could totally determine what is right and wrong. Secondly, they exclude that moral properties are not necessarily connected to descriptive properties other than moral or subjective properties. That was my meta-ethics first part. That is the application of that meta-ethics picture and thesis on about the debate of the good commander, God, in morality. The debate about the relationship between morality and the existence of God is often framed by two theses about Euthyphro dilemma. Is an action good because God approves of it, or God approves of it because it is good. Or we ought to do the act because God commanded it. Or God commanded the act because we ought to do it. See, for me, these are in the main role, in the main function, the same meaning. Good and ought to do in this kind is the same, because this I can call evaluative judgments as normative judgments in the same sense, in the same terms. Well, those who claim the first option is true, adopt a voluntarist solution. Theory of divine command in common form is a kind of this voluntarist solution, because the morality of the action would essentially depend on the divine approval or commands. God would establish what is right and what is wrong. In this solution is implied the dependency thesis. This is Gabriel Biel's voluntarist theory. I have found in the paper from Professor Swinburne's what difference God makes to morality. And voluntarist theory, why? Because he claimed the reason why the divine will accept the things as does and does is not a goodness found independently in objectives by God, but the reason lies only in the divine will, which accepts things as having such and such degree of goodness. That's why they are good in that degree, and not vice versa. The second group, those who claim the second option is true, adopt a rationalist solution. The morality of the action would depend essentially on the nature of the actions. Reasons for action found in the natural features of the situation would establish the criteria for God or anyone to approve or to command. In this solution is implied an independence thesis. This is the Kant's rationalist theory found in groundwork of the metaphysics of moral. Remembering Kant is Christian and was a Christian until he will dead. Was dead. But this is his moral philosophy, and this is his position about UFU dilemma. We could call the Kant's version of the UFU dilemma. The ontological conception of perfection is better than the theological conception, which derives morality from a divine, absolutely perfect will. It's preferable to the theological view first, because we have no intuition of the divine perfection and can only deduce it from our own conceptions, the most important of which morality. If we avoid this, the only notion of the divine will remaining to us is a conception made up of the attributes of desire, of glory, and domination. The heart of the dilemma is that either God would approve an action based on the nature of the act, for example, being an act of killing massively innocent people, I mean an act of genocide, which would provide objective reasons for approval, or God will approve an action based solely on His will, without relying on anything prior to His omnipotence. If God does not have objective reasons to approve how He approves, and everything depends on His will, an action could be right or wrong regardless of the nature of the action. Regardless, it is an act of genocide, for example. Just God is who would give it more value. Actions would not inherently relate to the kind of things they are or they imply. This would make it strange to call God a good God in the appropriated meaning of the word good, to call God a good God in the appropriated meaning of the word good. Because the sentence, God is good, would mean God approves of God. And say that God is good would be just a way of saying that good is what God commands arbitrarily. If God is good, we need to find the features of the God that makes God a good God for we to admire and to adore Him. The results of the metaethics initial clarification were that subjectivism and intuitionism did not remain standing before the supervenience, and only non-cognitivism and naturalism remain, and that thus two things should exclude that individual subjective decisions are to determine what is morally right and wrong, and that moral properties are disconnected from natural properties. These two theses are false or are not appropriated logically. Now, the first one rules out that morality depends on the mere individual approval of subject of approval, being God or being human beings. And the second one rules out that morality depends on the existence of non-natural things or beings, regardless the natural properties of the world. Theories and arguments that assume or include such subjectivist or intuitionist conceptions of moral judgments are prima facie wrong. If we adopt the naturalist or rational non-cognitivist conception of evaluative judgments and normative judgments, then it's only the independence thesis that remains intelligible, understandable. An interesting result is as follows. If someone claims God is supremely good by nature, and thus His commands would always be prescribing what is by nature good, this person will be adopting the rationalist solution and the independence thesis for the beautiful dilemma. There must be reasons for God to be a good God, and this cannot be that He has a good will or His nature is good. This would be begging the question. Of course, God, if exists, is good. The most good being that exists. But the reasons we have for saying this are the actions and the character and of God have the features they have related to the world and the logic of moral language. There is the facts more logic of moral language. That is a kind of golden rule logic in moral problems. are what constrains all rational beings to do the same act in the same circumstances. And this constrains God too. A good supreme being will think and act morally accordingly the golden rule, reasoning with the natural facts of the situation. Well, this is Jesus' answer to the beautiful dilemma. A man came up to him saying, "Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good. If you would enter life, keep the commandments." This is the Jesus series of the Divine Command. Divine Command series. And this is the Kant's answer. The Christian Kant's answer. But whence have we the conception of God as the supreme good, simply form the idea of moral perfection, which reasons frames a priori? Conclusion: if theism is false, we still have a sound foundation for morality. This is because subjectivist interpretation of morality is logically wrong. Objective moral duty does not mean the action A is required of me if and only if someone commands me with a singular prescription to do the action A. Objective moral duty means action A is universally required of all subjects, God included, because of its natural features, facts, conjugated with logical constraints, and it obligates us to think this. The first comes from reasons, not from commanders. Like the film May the Force Be With You. Conclusion: if good God exists, He ought to approve just what is morally right and good. If God does not exist, but a natural world exists with rational beings, such rational beings ought to approve just what is morally right and good. Then the rationalist solution and the independence thesis do not imply we have a foundation for atheism, and they also do not imply we do not have a sound foundation for morality. The dependence thesis states God as necessary for morality, as its subject of approval, imprimatur, the supreme commander, but morality in its appropriated meaning is the criterion for good approval commands. A moral command is a command without commander. Then God, if there is a God, is the supreme commander of the universe, but is not the commander of morality. Thank you. How much time is?
Obrigado, Alcino, pela sua apresentação. Temos até 5.
Ah, é?
Temos ainda 25 minutos para a discussão.
Lira.
E se tiverem perguntas, Rodrigo.
There's two things I want to ask you about your presentation, and I would like you to congratulate you for the presentation. It will probably make my presentation far more easy than it would be without your presentation. You said that for you there is an equivalence between good and bad and ought and ought not. Isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think this is troubling because there are lots of good actions that are not obligatory. So to feed all the stray cats in the streets is arguably a good thing, but it's not my obligation. Nobody would certainly condemn me for not feeding all of them. So there is at least one action that is good, but that I'm not obligated to do. So I don't think there's an equivalence there. The other thing is the title of your presentation is God and Goodness.
Yeah.
And you concluded that morality doesn't need God to be objective. But there are a lot of other ways in which God can play a part in explaining morality. For example, God can be the best explanation for persons like us to have a moral awareness. It's an argument from Professor Swinburne, for example, that our moral awareness is better explained by the existence of God than the natural evolution combined with naturalism. What do you say about that? Do you think that apart from the objective character of morality, God has any part to play in explaining the other effects of morality?
Probably, but I don't know. What I was saying is about the second part of your question, that if even God only is a good God and makes moral judgment, if He approves universally certain features of the natural world, we cannot say that only God is explanation, and it's the best explanation of our moral awareness, because our moral awareness depends on only our reason and the natural facts. And if we are rational beings that can access the natural facts, and we can, and if we are rational beings that can use a kind of logic, like the logic of the golden rule, we don't not need other kind of explanation. Of course, other kind of features, including God making the same universal prescriptions based on the same natural facts, using the same logic, would be a good thing for everyone, and is the case for theists and for Christian theists. But this is compatible with say that God is not in His will and commandments necessary, and if we have not God, only reason and facts are not sufficient. Being an animal that evolution makes capable of reasoning, including moral reasoning, and objective knowledge about the world, is not the ground of the non-religion's basis of morality. The basis of morality is rationality and natural facts. What we need is to accept that rationality that we and evolution give us is not closed and limited to the evolution. Is a kind of lifting of scale that can bring us higher and higher and higher, and we can confront the evolution. About the first one, about the difference between good and duty and evaluative judgments and out judgments or normative judgments. First answer would be say that in the main function of the evaluative judgments, good and right values and duties have the same function to approve things, because the features of the situation in a kind of universal perspective that does not include particular proper names and proper particular individuals, particular spaces and particular times. This is the logic of good. Secondly, it could be possible that supererogatory and normative strongly are only an intuitive and practical distinction, not a critical distinction. If we have all the facts about a situation in specific terms, probably the person or the situation will say, this only good is not your duty. In the critical sense, is what he ought to do because he is good to do, or this is good to do, and this is good to do because he ought to do that. But for practical and intuitive uses in common morality, is a very good thing to distinct the distinction between supererogatory and obligatory. But my problem here was the distinction between bad and wrong in one side and good and right in the other side, not obligation versus supererogation and or good, because both of them depend on the same logic and the same natural facts, and this excludes the necessity of a singular command. And for answer, if we need a commander and a necessary command, this needs to be a good command of a good commander. And so we need the same logic for explaining the command and the commander. This is my answer. This is a hypothesis. I don't know if I was clear.
May I follow? Yes, I understand the relation between good and ought and bad and ought not. But just to clarify, do you think that because feeding all the stray cats in the city is a good thing, then I ought to do it, then I am obligated to do it, then I am wrong of not doing it?
Yes, in a
I
certain...
can be held accountable in this.
In a certain kind of situation, for example, if give food to the cat is very easy to you, and not give the food to the cat is very, very bad to the cat, probably you ought to do the merely good act. But this is in the critical level of moral thinking. Of course, as feeding the cat, and not feeding the cat because you will do other good things or other normative things, is good, is right for intuitive moral thinking. Probably there are good reasons for the distinction, but you only ought not to feed the cat if you have other good action more important to do, or other normative action that you ought to do, only in this case.
Feed the cat. So,
Feed.
yes.
Thank you. A question on language. Well, what is a nephew? A nephew is someone who has an uncle. I cannot be a nephew if I have no uncles. Okay? We agree with this. It's a merely linguistic point. Okay, I'd like to extend the same to that sentence you wrote there. A moral command is a command without commander.
Yeah.
Okay, there is no nephew without an uncle. Can a command exist without a commander?
Yes, it can.
This is the point.
Yes.
If I am a son, okay, it's because I have a father.
Yes.
Okay, that's you have relational words, and I am afraid that command and commander are relational words as well. If you have a command, it's because you have an imperative established by someone, or I don't know, something if you want, but you need a commander. A command without a commander would be a nephew without an uncle.
Yes, no, this is not the correct analogy, because...
How is it, please?
Thank you. Yeah, just thank you for your question. Thanks for your question. I could be probably wrong, but the answer is this. Command depends on commander, like nephew depends on uncle, but a moral command does not depend on commander. Nephew, son, uncle, father are terms to refer to things, to define or to describe objects. Moral is not a term to refer to things primarily, but to approve things primarily. When I call nephew one because he is nephew only because he has an uncle, I'm not approving or prescribing, okay? But this is not a total answer, because the second one, if a command depends on the commander, why moral command does not depend on commander? For example, conventional morality depends on society. Legal commands depends on legislators. But objective moral commands cannot depend on legislator, society, or commander, because we only can to approve this commander and command, and we do this. We can ask if the law is a good law, and we can ask if the custom is a good custom, and so we cannot define the evaluative term like good in terms of descriptive reference. And so there must be any kind of difference of the good and ought to do meaning, and the fact that there is a conventional morality, a legal commands, or a religious commands. And thirdly, if we want to get objective morality, and we want, and everyone good people accept that Hitler is bad, genocide is wrong, this is bad, and he is bad, and that is wrong, because the facts are as they are, and the logic that people use, commanders are using for evaluation, approbation, the natural facts, create objective prescriptions. And objective prescriptions does not depend on a prescriber.
Okay. May I go ahead? Okay. You have two different languages, okay? You have a language where you speak about fact and so on, and the fact where you evaluate.
Yeah.
And you say about facts, it would be okay to say a nephew needs an honor. Okay. But usually, you would agree, a command needs a commander. In the army, if a soldier gets a command, it's because the sergeant says, do this and that.
A command, but not a moral command.
Okay, but I would say, if you have another kind of language, why don't you have another kind of words for this? Because it's a different thing. At least I can conclude, at least, that your words, I don't mean personally, I mean the words of this theory, your words are not good words. It's a bad semantic. Because you keep the same words, but with another content. You see?
Yes.
It's very different. You should have at least...
No, you are wrong, because there are not two languages. We have one language where one singular word like good could be used in descriptive sense, and could be used in prescriptive, evaluative sense. And this is your language and the ordinary language of all of us when you are using universal prescriptions that pretends that are only the natural facts and the logic, the two things that determine what is good or right as moral truths. It's very simple. My opinion about the earth around the sun is not true because it's my opinion if my reference is something objective. And this could be true because only the facts. But we can have the other notion of objectivity if thing is bad or a prescription is wrong. Because if any one of us following a kind of logic and considering the facts will have this prescription and not that prescription. And so this is a universal prescription. And because it is, I said, yes, a command depends a commander, but a moral command does not depend a commander. And this is your sense of moral. This is not idiosyncratic uses of language. But I have other answers. We have logical norms, and we don't need a logic commander because is independent. We have mathematicians' laws, and we don't need a legislator. We have physical laws, and we probably could only the world and facts and reason. We don't need accept that natural laws needs a commander. So we don't need that moral laws needs a commander.
I cannot go, let's say, I cannot monopolize the discussion, but thank you.
I agree with your conclusion that the fundamental truths of moral goodness are independent of the will of God. And Aquinas and Scotus would also have agreed with you on this point. But that doesn't mean to say that commands cannot create moral obligations. The state issues commands to me at various times to pay taxes, possibly even to serve in the army. That certainly creates, of course, a legal obligation, but assuming it's a reasonably state and one or two other conditions, perhaps, then it also creates a moral obligation if I refuse to pay my taxes. So commands can certainly create obligations. Why does the state issuing commands create an obligation that someone else issuing a command does not? Well, because the state is our benefactor. It looks after us in various ways. And a fortiori, of course, God looks after us all the time and is responsible for our existence. So if God commands us to do something, that is going to create a moral obligation. Now, of course, you depend on the equivalence between good and ought. And like previous speaker, that seems to me mistaken. Clearly, it's always good to do what we ought to do, but there are good things which go beyond obligation.
Don't forget to...
There are good actions which go beyond obligation, nevertheless, God could command us in virtue of His being the source of our being to do things for Him because He has done so much for us that we would not otherwise have an obligation to do. All the parallels with the obligations created by parents, the army and the state seem to give force to that.
Okay, I understand it, but I think when a father commands something, these commands could be asked if the command is good or not good. The command cannot good only because father commanded it. Of course, a military general, no problem. Of course, a military general that commands soldier turn right is a command, but this command could be asked, why turn right? And probably he will say, what reason? This is my command. I am the general. And logically he is right because he said turn right. But if he was stated, you ought to turn right. And the soldier would ask, in a possible world, soldiers don't ask the commander, okay? But if the soldier asks him, why I ought to turn right, the commander necessarily has to give some reason, because we cannot use ought with a reason, because ought is supervenient, like good. And because this is a moral commander, or a moral command and a value command is different of a command and a singular desire. And singular desire of God could be asked by children or by adults, why are you commanded this? Of course. And I accepted that as general. If they said, do this, they don't need to give an explanation. But God will have pleasure to give an explanation. My thesis is we cannot understand this desire of God to give explanation with God giving an explanation in terms of divine command theory, but in terms of naturalist or rationalist moral theory. And this has implications for our comprehension of the relationships between morality and religion. Thank you. And sorry, my answers will be effort to defend a position hypothetically. I am constructing my position, my personal, real position, and I could be in very mistakes, and I could be wrong, of course.